Hi everyone, welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, Sally.
Hi, lovely to meet you all.
Lovely to meet you.
I'm not sure if that's Anik or Sam there, just to give us the all clear that we're ready to kick off.
Yeah, we were speaking with Sam and we're ready to go.
Okay, fantastic. So shall I just begin proceedings in that case?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Welcome everybody to this Brochure Foundation meetup. I'm Sally Davies, the Senior Editor at Eon Magazine, and it's my pleasure today to chair the meetup. So to introduce the subject just very briefly, in many ways, I think it's fair to say that we appear to be living in something of a golden age of biological, genomic and bioinformatic research. Rapid advances in machine learning and data science, coupled with the decreasing cost of genomic testing and analysis, is opening up fascinating new clinical treatments. Oh, sorry, my screen has just expanded to remove my notes. It's opening fascinating new clinical treatments and insights into human development and disease. However, the way researchers, companies and institutions manage this fascinating new data raises profound ethical questions. Who should have access to genomic data and under which circumstances? How can one balance the benefits of data sharing and open access on the one hand with the necessity to maintain the privacy and confidentiality of donors on the other? How effective are existing regulatory frameworks and what could be done to improve them? So today, in today's meetup, we're going to hear from our esteemed panelists, Brochure Foundation Fellows on these and other questions. I think the plan is that we're going to have a conversation for around 45 minutes, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes addressing questions from the audience. So please, if participants would like to drop any questions in the chat, we'll be sure to see those. I did also just want to add on a personal note that I had a baby a matter of weeks ago, and although I have childcare for today's session, if there's any sort of feeding emergency, I may need to turn the video off and microphone briefly, but I trust that the panelists will be able to talk among themselves, and all being well, if we shouldn't, that shouldn't be a problem. What would make sense to kick off? I would normally ask each of the panelists for you to introduce yourself and your key area of research. Chiara, on my screen now I can see that there's a presentation from you. So would that be appropriate as a kind of kickoff for the discussion?
Sure, whatever you think best, Sally. I think the four of us are quite flexible. Just to let you know that Paulina messaged to say she's just held up and she's going to be a little bit late.
Right, okay. Well, look, maybe to start with, why don't we have each of you here, Deborah, Calvin and Chiara, just introduce yourselves and your orientation on the topic of today's meetup. I'll just go in order of, I'll just go in order of who I can see on my screen. So Chiara, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Congratulations, Sally. Thank you for joining us when you have a newborn having your attention. So Sally's mentioned, my name is Ciara Staunton. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Biomedicine in URAC, research in Bolzano in the north of Italy. And so my research is very much on the regulation of new and emerging technologies, and in particular, the use of health and genomic data. I've done a lot. I did my postdoc as part of the H3 Africa consortium down in Cape Town, and over the past 3 years I've been at URAC Research looking at health data sharing from a European perspective in particular. Very much looking at the new developments that's been happening in Europe, particularly the impact that the draft proposal of the European health data space is likely going to have on the health data, both in Europe, genomic data sharing in Europe and also globally.
Thank you, Ciara, and my apologies for mispronouncing your name there. Deborah, would you like to jump in next?
Sure. So I'm Deborah Mascalzoni from Uppsala University, and I also have an appointment at Europe myself. And I'm a bioethicist by background, and I have been working with genomic data in the last few years, let's say. I think that we are in a very special moment in which really redefining a little bit how we look at genomic data, and the use of genomic data is really going to have an impact on how we shape our health future. So I think that this meeting is very timing, and thank you all for having me here.
Thank you, Deborah. And Calvin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks very much, and adding my congratulations as well, Sally.
Thank you.
I am Calvin O. Delighted to be here and very happy to be involved in this very important conversation. I am an associate professor with the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, and also the co-director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law, which is jointly run by the law school and the medical school in this institution. My research area, quite similar to Chiara, is in the regulatory governance of emerging technologies. Quite aside from this, I also research into ethical as well as legal issues in global health. Let me just end off my introduction with a big thank you to Chiara for putting this panel together, to Deborah as well, to Sally for the wonderful introduction, and our wonderful colleagues at Fondation Brochet. Nick and Sam, thanks so much for getting us all organized. So it's back to you, Sally.
Well, I really am here to just serve as a platform for your voices. So given Chiara, it looks like you prepared a presentation. Would that be an appropriate place to kick off, or otherwise
Sure.
I can just dive in with questions?
I'm happy for both. It might be much more interesting for everyone is to have maybe the question, and we can see how it goes. I'm not sure.
Okay, no, that's great. Well, I'm very happy to do that. I mean, I think just to begin, I think it would be really interesting to get a sense of the overall terrain of the ethical, legal, and social issues concerning genomic data. Would someone, or maybe Chiara, I can direct this to you, would you be in a position to lay out for us what a few of the big lightning rod questions are in this area that you think regulators and observers concerned with it should be focusing on?
Well, sure. If we look at it from a European context first, what we do see is that genomic data sharing is very much heavily driven by the GDPR and its implementation at a national level. Now, while we have the GDPR, which is all about harmonization of data protection, because of the special interest that we have in research and science, the GDPR, as it was written, contains quite a few derogations for research. And what this meant is that how the GDPR has been implemented across the EU member states is very different. So that's challenging in the context of collaborative research. It is also very difficult to send genomic data outside of Europe for the purposes of data sharing. When Deborah and I were in contact with the NIH, they said that most of the projects that they're involved with since the introduction of the GDPR, they're no longer able to share genomic or get genomic data sent to them. But we're also seeing an increasing number of countries across the world introducing similar data protection regulations and similar levels of protection. Now, my concern is that very much the focus has been focused on, the attention has been focused on privacy and the underlying assumption that privacy is the only issue at stake, when it's not. We are seeing decreasing levels of control for individuals around their genomic data and how it may be used. For example, this proposal draft European health data space that was introduced in May of this year, it's going to, I think the phrase they use in recital 33 is that they want to unleash the data, and this feeling that they want to share and enable the secondary use of genomic data for a number of reasons, purposes that's not just research. Now, on the face of it, that would seem fine. Who doesn't want science to progress? Who doesn't want new therapies to get to us? The problem is how they're going to do this, and this decreasing, it's kind of like a gradual erosion of the right to autonomy as it relates to our genetic data since the Nuremberg Code right up till now. So I think I'll stop there and I'll let Calvin or Deborah jump in now.
Yeah, maybe if I may just follow up on what Chiara is saying, I think that by focusing a lot on this very complicated legal framework we had for genomic use and genomic data sharing, we started to work a lot through documents and administrative complications. Every researcher is complying about how complicated it is to share data, etc., forgetting that GDPR was not designed to address research in the first place, but also that the GDPR is not the ethical framework for research in Europe or elsewhere. It has been designed for something else entirely. And now it has become somewhat the only reference when we are talking about research ethics in genomics, which is quite weird because, of course, it is focusing on a very, very specific aspect of it. To the extent that I face big institutions starting big projects that do not apply for ethical review because they are okay with the GDPR and therefore they don't need ethical clearance. So we are really like, you know, facing, I would say, discrepancy between the two realms, and also kind of a redefinition of what ethics is. I heard today someone saying, "Oh yeah, but you know, talking about LC, ethical, legal, and social issues in research, why do we need the E anyway?" So, as an ethicist, I must say I'm a bit concerned, because I think we are losing really like some of the dimensions for which ethical review and ethical help was needed by focusing so much on technicalities of the law.
It's really interesting because it almost sounds like the classification of genomic data as data seems to almost be an exhaustive categorization, when actually what we're looking for is, of course, on the one hand, it would arguably be important that institutions working with genomic data comply with GDPR, but that's not the only benchmark for an ethical research process. And what you seem to be saying, Deborah, is that people are considering it kind of necessary and sufficient condition to meet ethical approval, which is very concerning.
Yes.
Interesting. Calvin, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thanks very much for this opportunity to weigh in on the topic. So I think in this part of the world, we're seeing some rather interesting developments. So in Hong Kong, of course, privacy itself or data protection remains very important. But in terms of our legal framework, it's essentially that of the Data Protection Act, very similar to that in the UK. So if you're familiar with the pre-EU Data Protection Act, then it has been in that form. So you'd see essentially the data protection principles that, of course, has been emphasized, particularly data protection principle number 1 and number 3. So 1 relates to collection and, of course, the consent requirements, and then 3 pertaining to use. So you'd see quite a lot of developments in terms of the pronouncement of the Privacy Commissioner here. To her credit, she has been very proactive in supporting developments, positive changes. So that has essentially been the basic data framework in terms of how such personal information has been applied, whether it's within a clinical setting or otherwise in research. What's interesting, of course, is that there has been a number of admission of the norms that we see that's associated with GDPR, although we haven't got the provisions here in our statute. So it's been incorporated through this less formal route. So it's not through legislation, but in practice, you'd see that. Across from us on mainland China, of course, what's really interesting is that you'd have recently coming into effect last year, the Personal Information Protection Law. The provisions are essentially similar to that of the GDPR. However, what's interesting is that because the social institutions are very different, it remains to be seen how the norms are going to be implemented across on the mainland. But what's interesting on the mainland is that quite aside from the Personal Information Protection Law, there are other privacy provisions that have been set out in the Civil Code. I think what's important, at least looking at the subject of data in this part of the world, the emphasis is to try to avoid treating it like a commodity, but to emphasize instead the relations that are developed around this notion of personal data. So the emphasis is less about control. Of course, there's that aspect, but we want to try to shift the focus to what ultimately would be solidaristic kind of contribution to the common good, particularly within a research framework. So that's broadly where we're at over here in Hong Kong and a bit of developments on mainland China. It's back to you, Sally.
Oh, look, that's very interesting. I mean, I'm conscious that the topic of today's discussion is indeed focusing on Asia, Africa, and Europe. So I think the interplay of the regulatory framework between these regions is really important. Just to sort of slightly change the lens here, I did just want to clarify. I just wonder if we could take this to kind of a concrete level so that we move away from abstractions and kind of talk about what exactly are some of the use cases that would be interesting here, that would raise some of these ethical and regulatory concerns. I mean, as I understand it, not being an expert in this area as the three of you are, what we're talking about here is databases that are sometimes publicly owned or might be owned by research institutions that essentially contain genetic information from donors. And then the idea being that data may have been collected for a specific purpose, so as to, for example, discern the relationship between certain genes and then certain illnesses. But then a third party may have a different data set, and by combining those two data sets, there may be another set of insights about some other question that was unrelated to the initial purpose for the collection. I just wondered if anyone could sort of talk about some case studies that have either been the subject of kind of discussion or controversy, or Deborah, you were mentioning kind of research projects that haven't been able to go ahead, for example, because you know the European party can't comply with GDPR. I just wonder, for the benefit of panelists, or rather benefit of audience members who aren't experts in this area, if we could kind of take this discussion to a granular level and sort of talk about some of these ethical and regulatory questions using a specific example. I'm conscious, of course, some of this stuff may be sensitive, so it may be difficult to talk about in a public forum, but you know, we don't necessarily need to mention names, but if you're aware of any case studies where we could talk about the actors without naming names, but just so that we can kind of peg some of these more abstract questions onto the concrete. Does anything spring to mind for any of you?
Well, many issues. I just wonder how we want to proceed, whether to start from some case studies or whether we should do like the introductions first and then start to talk a bit about the case studies. As up to you, of course.
Oh, certainly. I mean, if by way of introductions, do you mean just to talk about the sort of top level issues, or?
No, I was thinking about like the small presentations we did prepare.
Oh, okay. No, I'm sorry, of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry, I was just following Kira's lead there to sort of say that I would ask some questions, but very happy for each of you to do the presentations. No, not to steal your thunder in any way.
No, up to you. Maybe just to throw on the table, there are several cases of misuse and, of course, of projects that were either blocked because they're not compliant, but also of projects that actually did go on, but not in a shape in which any of us probably would have liked them to go on. So I think there are different levels of the discussion. That's why maybe. Yeah.
Well, no, for sure. Let's move to the presentations then, and then maybe we can circle back to some of these questions. So, Kira, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll just go through it very, very quickly because I was just going to talk a little bit about the European health data space. And so, like we've been already talking about, here we have huge amounts of genomic and health data which has been collected either for research or research purposes or for other purpose that people want to reuse of them for research. And the problem is that we know that much of this data is locked away, and there are very many reasons for those we've already talked about already. The GDPR, the fact that we have data protection regulations across Europe implemented in a fragmented way. But we also see that many organizations, and particularly commercial entities, are using data protection as an excuse not to share data. But there's also kind of technical, infrastructural, ethical, legal, and other ethical concerns around why we are not sharing data. Now, during COVID, we saw a shift when it came to data sharing, that open access and data sharing very much became the norm. And following on this, and data sharing has been in part credited with the success of the vaccines. And so the European Commission has very much wanted to unlock the data and unleash the benefits of the secondary use of health data. And so how are they proposing to go about this? Well, the proposal, and it is a draft proposal at this moment, this regulation, the European health data space, it's focusing on the primary use of data, which is all about our electronic health records, which I won't go into here, but it's having the secondary use. And what it wants to do is create a legal framework that's applicable to all member states, and which will provide a legal framework to enable the secondary use of electronic health data. And what it is going to require is that a data holder must make available to data user electronic health data for secondary purposes. Now, when you look through the definitions under the European health data space, we see that this definition of electronic health data is very, very wide. It covers all types of health data, both related to wellness applications or electronic health records, as well as genomic, genetic, and proteomic data. And then it wants to make it available for secondary purposes. At the moment, we're very much focusing or often hear the conversation around enabling secondary use of data for research. Well, the European health data space wants to make it available for all of these 8 purposes. And you'll see that some of them does relate to research, but others are quite broad relation to providing personalized healthcare, training, testing, and development of AI systems. So we're seeing very much an extension of what the conversation was had, which was very much related to research, to all of these other purposes. It also explains who needs to make data available and to whom. So we have a data holder. The data holder is where you will get the data from. And they're any natural or legal person, which is an entity or body in the health sector. So that is who you can make an application to get their data. And the data user is going to be the person who will make an application. And as you can see, it's a natural or a legal person who's lawful access to personal or non-personal electronic health data. Basically, it's anyone. If they meet the criteria under the European health data space, it is them who will make their data available. Who can apply to make their health data available. Now, how do you go about getting access? So you want to access electronic health data for a secondary purpose. So what are you going to do? You need to make an application to a body which is going to become known as a health data access body. You need to show that it's limited, you're following the principles of purpose limitation and data minimization. But if you succeed in meeting the criteria, the health data access body, this new proposed body, will issue a data permit, and the data holder will be obliged to share the data within 2 months. So this seems to be quite good. People are wanting to get a lot of data available for secondary purposes. So is this as good news as we think it will be? Well, at the moment, while I agree with some of the objectives, I do have some critiques or concerns, and then I'll stop here and we can maybe talk about some of them later. My first concern is that legal legitimacy does not guarantee a social license. And what I mean is, just because you are legally providing a framework to enable the secondary use of health data does not mean that the public are going to support this. It is their data, after all. It's your and I data. And we are not having any say in this entire process. Again, as we talked about, the assumption is the privacy is the only concern in the secondary use of data. When it's not, we can have concerns around discrimination, exploitation, and so on. And also, one of the concerns I would have is that one of the rights that the GDPR gave us is that we have a right to information when our personal data is being used. Now, this right can be derogated from in the context of research. So if a research team is using our health data, they don't have to inform each of us every time our data has been used. But the justification for the derogation of that is because of the important social value of research that it has in our society. But this derogation to the right to information is going to be applied to all of these 8 secondary purposes. So while first it used to be just focused on research, it's going to be extended to all of these 8 purposes. And also, a final concern that I have is that there is no guarantee of equity of benefit. We will be forced to be, there will be an obligation to make data available if they meet that criteria, but there's no guarantee that the public will actually get the benefit. We saw that in COVID, there was this massive data sharing enterprise where data was shared across the world, and we did see the quick development of the vaccine. But we also saw that once the vaccines were developed, national and commercial interests took over. And if we're going to be making this data available, we need to ensure that there is going to be true equity of benefit. And I will stop there.
That's really interesting. Answers actually some of the questions I had about this new framework, Kira. So thank you. I think we can come back to some of these critiques because I think they're very interesting. Deborah, did you want to come in at that point with your presentation? Will it fit with Kira's? I think you might be on mute.
I will fix this as well and try to share my screen as well. Okay. Let's see. Can you see the presentation?
Yes,
I can on my screen. Yeah.
Okay. Is it in presentation mode? Okay.
It is. Yeah.
Perfect. So I start with the question: are we forgetting something in the discourse about data use, genomic data use in Europe and beyond? So we know that we're relying a lot on GDPR. But again, GDPR really focuses on one part, but even the discourse that just here presented about the data space is focusing a lot on open science, extensive use of data, etc. But in all this discourse, we are really forgetting about the ethical use of data. So I push this point because I have been experiencing, and you were asking for examples. One is from Friday. I'm really experiencing projects that are completely forgetting not only ethical clearance, but also, what we call the public purpose, the public interest of research. Because I think that ethically, we are working on a lot of assumptions when we are talking about data sharing. First, that research is always beneficial. Second, that we have ethical frameworks in place that ensure that anyway data are used in a proper way because we have ethical review, because we have ethical oversight. Well, this is quite different in Europe, in many different countries. While we aim for a situation like this, in which we have, a very nice equal shared type of ethical and legal framework. That was the aim of the GDPR, really, in which individual rights and research needs are balanced. We are actually seeing a lot of those rights that are clearly stated by the GDPR as being interpreted as exceptions when it's concerning intensive data use and use in research. So a lot of these rights fall under research exemption, both to the right of access, the right to leisure, the right to be informed. They all fall under either national or even international derogations. So when we apply all these derogations, we actually end up in a situation like this one, that is actually a very diverse landscape, even in Europe, on how to apply the regulation. But also, we end up in a situation in which individual rights and research needs or research use are not balanced anymore if we don't put in some corrections, I would say, or at least we don't apply something that goes beyond the GDPR. Because in fact, GDPR ethics and research are not only regulated through the GDPR, both in Europe and in the world, but rather we have plenty of instruments that have been designed throughout the decades to regulate research. Somewhat, those are not even mentioned, interestingly enough, when we are talking about data spaces, etc. So how comes? Somewhat, we kind of narrowed down the issues of privacy and data use to privacy, but also privacy intended in a very narrow sense, which is identifiability. But is identifiability the only issue at stake? Is the only risk or interest related to the data? Well, we know that actually identifiability is somewhat not really the main point when we are talking about data flows and data use. And the Ada Lovelace Institute tells us clearly that anything that doesn't address the underlying business models of the data economy would not fundamentally change the system, because we are kind of approaching it in a very narrow and naive sense, not tackling what are the real social and ethical issues related to data. So even when we look at it from a narrow point of view, we know that privacy and reality check are two different things. We know that when we share genetic data, those can be easily transformed into, for instance, facial maps. That's it. New techniques, and not even very new at this stage, because this is a paper that came out in 2019, so already a couple of years ago. But also, we know that what is related to data is risk of digital surveillance, population discrimination, unequal distribution of benefits, as Kira pointed out, for instance, throughout the COVID, and potentially the digital divide. We also know that is a great chance for the world. We need the data sharing and we need the research to happen. So how can we, put this work together? Well, today, I'm not sure we will able to answer the questions, but we will able to throw out some ideas and some questions. A lot of people in the ELSI world are working on those topics. So who defines the use? When we're talking about secondary use of data, Kira just tackled it for the European data space. We're not only talking about, a direct impact for this small bit of use. Who is responsible for this data use? What is impacting this data use? And what are the responsibilities towards the participants? Who holds this responsibility? GDPR clearly states the data controller is the one responsible for that, etc. But in a world in which we have a public database, research database, or even, already happening consortia projects, etc., it's very unclear who is responsible, for instance, for a misuse or a data breach, etc. We're working a lot towards a system that needs to account for many aspects. Justice is one of those. And of course, one of the frameworks that has been, proposed is the data solidarity frameworks that I very much like, as long as it really addresses the complexity that is beyond it. Because this framework has been abused in the past, I would say. They say, yeah, we are sharing data based on solidarity, but yes, solidarity entails responsibility as well. So we need to facilitate data use that creates significant public value, but public value needs to be designed together. It's not something that the interested party can address and design for himself. But also we need to have measures in place measures to prevent harm and to mitigate risk. So those are all tools that we have in our ethics database, but are also solutions that needs to be rethought, rethink, and redesigned with the future that we have in mind. So we really need to reimagine this health future together somewhat. So defining processes to define public value, enforcing ethical oversight, enforcing, not canceling ethical oversight, and include public in the definition of safeguards and objectives for the use of data. And I will conclude with one sentence that was brought into the national event for 25 years of privacy in Italy. We're not talking about data, we are talking about people. So I will end here and happy to discuss.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I would really like to come back to this question of what solidarity means and how that is actualized in the context of the data economy and what we might call surveillance capitalism, which genomic data arguably has the potential to accelerate in very dystopian ways. But before we get back to those very interesting questions, Calvin, would you like to share your presentation before we open up the discussion a bit more?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Lisa. Let me share my slides. I'm just going to jump straight to the use case that we spoke about. Let's see, is that visible to everyone?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah, thanks very much. So this is a specific application, and I think it's, or at least where Deborah left off, I think it very nicely speaks to what we're attempting to do here in Hong Kong, and that's not to forget the people. I think it's also implicit in Kiera's presentation in terms of thinking about what in the international law context is known as the right to benefit from science. So if we think about an initiative that's been taken up here, it's quite recent. It was launched in 2021. You see, it's the first large-scale genome sequencing project in Hong Kong. So the project itself has completed the pilot phase, and it's entering into the main phase of the research. But what you find here is that although we speak of the research dimension, it's very closely linked to the clinical aspect. So you see both essentially as moving in tandem. The focus of the project, as you see on the slide, is on diseases, so starting with research cohorts, but we want to look into undiagnosed diseases, hereditary cancer, and diseases related to genomics and of course, precision health. So where patients as well as family members are recruited, you see that it's essentially voluntary, and they are engaged with families who are keen to look for potential disease-causing genetic variants, essentially through whole genome sequence analysis. So you see, it's a collaborative platform. It's not therefore as big as what we've heard from Kiera and Deborah in terms of the developments in Europe, but we're starting up there. And as I've mentioned earlier on, trying to always keep close to the participants in terms of their more immediate concerns, and then of course encouraging them to think about contributing to research. And I thought that just to focus on one element, there are quite a few dimensions. If you think about consent, so these are the participant information documents that have been prepared by the project team. So we've got one that speaks to adults, which will be 18 and above, and then of course children, given that we are concerned with hereditary diseases. So that you also find essentially a coming together of a number of the principles. As I've mentioned at the start of the discussion, we have the broad principles very similar essentially to what you'd find in the GDPR on purpose limitation, on the consent requirements, and the use of essentially only de-identified data. Of course, this will be provided that consent has been obtained from the participants. But here, I think it's important to bring in what Deborah has mentioned. So we don't just rely on the personal data privacy ordinance. So that's our personal data legislative framework to address some of the data concerns. But there you'd see a very important contribution in terms of institutional oversight. And because there are several institutions involved, that you'd see essentially a coming together, an agreement in terms of the sort of data that should be fed into the system, and then of course the sort of collaborative partnership that we ought to have with institutions on the one hand, but more importantly with the participants, who are themselves, of course, many of them patients or otherwise family members of the patients. So one important discussion that has gone on for some time would be in terms of the notification and follow-up with participants. So the ultimate position that's been arrived at is not very different from what you'd see elsewhere. But what's I think worth emphasizing is the project's team keenness to get these participants involved. Of course, there's been some discussion in more academic setting in terms of the dynamic consent kind of setup. But we want to put the focus less on the consent, but more in terms of the relationships and of course the continuing interest in the project. So quite aside from notifications, then there's also been quite a lot of discussion in terms of additional findings. So whether this comes from the more clinical aspects or the research aspects. So what you see here, again, ultimately the position arrived at is not very different from many of the other jurisdictions. There will generally be, of course, if participants themselves are willing to receive additional findings, disallowance, except for information that's uncertain, that might cause distress, or things that would, of course, affect the relationship, unless we're very clear that those involved are really interested to get into those kind of issues. And there, as you see in 11.2, right, that's the paragraph from the information booklet on issues of paternity, because very much in terms of paternity testing, if we think about it in a more clinical context. So, so those have been very important discussions. What has been also raised, of course, links or relates to a withdrawal of consent. So the extent that that the individuals concerned would want to remain involved in the project, or if they should decide not to, then what would be the follow-up action that be taken? And I think this discussion is important because a significant number of the participants will be children. So when they become 18 years of age, there will be a process of technically, of course, it's like reconsent, but there will be another discussion. I think a discussion would be a better way to put it, to ask if they continue to remain interested to participate in the research, how they see this as beneficial for themselves on the one hand, and perhaps contributing to the broader community on the other. So these are the sort of discussions that that will be had. So in tandem with these sort of developments, you see that there's a very strong push on the part of the project and also by local authorities to try to build up on genetic counseling capabilities. I think like in many other places in the world, that there are not enough counselors, and of course healthcare practitioners either do not have the time, or for that matter the expertise to be involved in this kinds of discussion. So that's why concretely we want to express solidarity. Of course we can go back to discuss what that means, but if we take a broad interpretation of that, we try to express this in actual practice rather than to hold on to a very nice conceptual understanding of this notion. So there are also initiatives to try to encourage participants, if they are so willing, to contribute or either their materials, biological materials, or data to other research. We haven't gone so far as I know, in thinking about some sort of centralized repository. You see, ultimately, the Hong Kong Genome Project itself now serves as one of the key platforms, but it's essentially collaborative. So it does not purport to control all of the data or the tissue samples, or serve as some sort of a jurisdictional data repository or otherwise a tissue repository. It might get there, but at this stage, it serves as a platform linking up the various institutions, involving participants as much as possible, and that's currently where we're at in this particular project. So that's all I have. Thanks very much, Sally, and it's back to you.
Right, that's really fascinating. Well, I think that does do a really good job of kind of laying out the terrain for us. I think I'd like to go back to Kira's presentation and the discussion of the draft regulations for the European health data space. I thought it was really interesting that the language surrounding this was, I think you said it was about unleashing the data, Kira. I mean, that certainly has a kind of ring of, you know, Silicon Valley sort of tech boosterism to it, as well as, of course, the kind of unleashing the animal spirits, you know, a kind of neoliberal economic model. And as I understand it, your presentation about the way that regulation is proposed to work is any data user has to meet a certain criteria for who they are. But if they meet those criteria, there isn't a broader discussion about the purposes for which that data is really going to be used, or there isn't this kind of broader ethical analysis. Did I misunderstand what you were saying?
No, you're absolutely correct. So as long as the purpose relates to one of the secondary purpose, then
Right.
you're fine. And so there's no issue, a question of did they consent? Now, if you look at, for example, and this issue of, because some countries in Europe, such as Italy, they require consent to the use of genetic data for research purposes. And it's not really clear, it doesn't seem to matter that is required. Now, the European Data Protection Board and European Data Protection Supervisor has issued a joint opinion critiquing it at the moment and says to comply with GDPR, changes do need to be made. So we will see what it goes on. But this issue of, if we have the framework as it currently is, arguably, provided that the Health Data Access Body approves it, some people or some biobanks, data banks, whatever, may be required or they now have an obligation to share data that, one, the participants did not necessarily consent to, or two, for purposes that aren't covered. For example, Deborah and I, we work at a biobank in the north of Italy. It's for basic research and non-profit use. But issues such as this and profit motives aren't considered. And we do a lot of the ELSI work on the secondary use of health data does indicate that the purpose and to whom and profit does matter to them on how their data is to be used. In the service, we always see altruism is very, very evident. People do want their data to be shared for the public interest. We need to have a conversation on what the public interest actually is. But when we are dealing with pharma, big tech companies, they do have concerns. No, I'm quite pragmatic. I understand for the research further, we do need to have involvement with pharma. But the question is, how do we actually do that? And I don't think that the current regulation as it's written is going to address many of the concerns that have been raised in the ELSI work in this area.
Deborah, I sense that you wanted to jump in there.
You sound
Please,
correctly.
go on.
Yes. No, I think there are two aspects here to be taken into account. One is really like what public interest is and how we define public value. I very much like the recent work of Barbara Pranczak about redefining public value instead of public interest, and in looking at it as something that is socially constructed together and that needs to hold specifics such as, protection of other values, etc. That's one part that seems to be completely missing in the European data space, but also like people, and we have really, big chunks of research going on. People are very happy to provide data for the public value, for enriching research, etc. But then, they're less happy to have their data completely unleashed to the world, as we know that there might be an impact on people. And bringing in some practical examples, we had the case of the Sardinian biobank database that at one point, due to complex situations of the institution that was holding it, was sold to an American research institution. Every participant in this biobank went to the national authority and withdrew their consent. I mean, it's not, a single person with some concerns. I mean, the whole court withdrew. So I think maybe this is something to take into consideration. People and their values and why they want to contribute. But also, going back to Calvin's presentation, I think that we have a lot of assumptions, as I said. The assumption, for instance, that international scientific databases do have rigorous procedures in place all the time, which sometimes is not the case. And now this is something that I need really to to investigate, but I report it as it was reported to me on Friday. Like if you apply for data from some very famous biobanks, you are not required to do like an ethical review of your project. Now, we can assume that research is beneficial to the world in general, but I mean, we know that this is not always the case. So what is, the balance, the check and balance here? We can agree on a broad consent so that, or, even to a broad use of data collected if there is a rigorous procedure in place. But then we need to focus on what those procedures are and on what values they are based. Because I have been hearing this over and over, but I have experience with Germany, Austria, Sweden, Italy, etc. And I know very often this is not the case. So should we take this seriously? What are the safeguards that we want in place to ensure this?
I'm curious, are there any specific examples of isolated jurisdictions or institutions that any of you feel are doing this well, not because they're compelled as a matter of regulation to do so, but they've taken it upon themselves to implement safeguards that you think are in keeping with these principles of solidarity, public value, addressing interests of donors that go beyond the question of privacy and identifiability and encapsulate the potential uses to which this data is put? Are there any examples that spring to mind of institutions that are doing this well? I mean, of course, the project you're involved with, Calvin, does sound like it's trying to bake these in from the start.
I think there are examples out there. I'm not saying that everything is bad, or quite the opposite. I think we are living in very different social frameworks as well. So very often I hear researchers from the UK claiming that less control is needed because there is a very safe research environment and research ethical framework for research in the UK. While I'm aware that in Italy this is not the case, so people are more, relying on the legal constraints that are put on the use of data, for instance. So that's something that we need to take into account a lot. So depending on the frameworks that we're working, I think that everyone is trying to do their best. But of course, we cannot only rely on goodwill. That's the problem. And potentially, as bad as it may seem, not every solution will fit every other situation that we will face. That's also a sad reality. And that is something that worries me about the European data space, because while we all want a harmonized framework, we all know how difficult it is to implement one.
It strikes me too that taking seriously this notion of public value in secondary use it's going to require potentially trading off certain rights against other rights, in the sense that we can't operate under an assumption that we can simply protect the right to privacy. It actually may be that there are sort of competing and conflicting interests at work here that we need to be willing to accept, and then have a kind of deliberative conversation about what matters most. Whereas it seems like the way the framework's currently set up, there's this sort of quite narrow assumption that means we just need to protect a sort of certain circumscribed right, and then everything is going to be okay. Whereas actually really what I'm taking away from this conversation is that the ethical questions are much more difficult, and there's going to be sort of hard trade-offs that we're going to have to accept.
Or, at least a trade-off that take account of the complexity and try to address the complexity as well. Because I don't think there aren't solutions around it. While I don't think that individual consent might be the answer to every use or secondary use of data, I know that there are, ethical reviews, procedures that can be applied to every use of data instead.
Yeah, for me, I would think that the European health data space is going to go through in some form or the other. It's an objective of the European Commission. But we are at a time where we have a real opportunity to kind of reshape and change our whole governance of the secondary use of data. Now, we were talking about unleashing the benefits of the secondary use of data, but we need to really think about how that does work in practice. Now, the European Commission doesn't talk about ethics because it doesn't have the competency to regulate ethics, and that's why it's always stood back. But all of these, the use of secondary data raise ethical issues that we now need to start thinking about. You know, things even they mentioned that there is the possibility of recuperation costs that are associated with the collection of the data. So it's potential to have a cost recovery plan in place, which is good when a lot of public money has been used and pharma want to access that data for benefit. But cost recovery plans are really, really challenging and difficult to develop and implement. And it seems like, you know, the focus is too much is how are we going to make the data available, and not enough of a focus of, okay, so here are valid concerns that people do have. How do we go about addressing them? Now, I didn't mention the primary use of data, but it's all about electronic health records and setting up a system of electronic health records to enable the so that we as individuals can share or move our health data records around with us. So this is a way that I would see that they can actually try and see how can they implement a process so that we still have an ongoing right to information, because people want to be informed. We can talk about whether or not we should have controls and what degree of controls, but we can, in tandem with developing this electronic health records, have a system that enables us to have our right to information.
No, and that's potentially, sorry.
No, please go ahead, Deborah.
We are really, you know, pushing a lot of technology to allow super wide data sharing and cross link of data, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't you use part of this technology to implement ethical tools to keep people in the loop, to inform people, to involve them in the conversation? You asked me about a nice project that I would think of, for instance, the Rudy project in the UK. I like it very much. This is with children, and it's really trying, you know, to engage those children and their parents throughout the length of the study, and try to design together what the study should be about and how the data should be used for the future. You know, there are ways forward.
I'm just conscious that we're coming up to the top of the hour, and we have some questions from audience members that it might be nice to address live. So coming from Robert Field, the question of whether the European Health Data Space permits data use that benefits for-profit entities, does it address intellectual property in products developed from the data and the generation of profits by private parties? I think that's one for you, Kira.
Yeah, for sure. So, Robert, the European Health Data Space doesn't look at who's applying for access and the profit motive. The issue is whether or not you as an individual or an entity match the criteria for the application. So there's absolutely nothing stopping for-profit users getting access. Does no, it doesn't very much touch on intellectual property at all. It does mention, if I recall correctly, something to do with confidentiality, and it's kind of vague, but you can say that if you do not want if I recall correctly, if you do not want your data made available for confidentiality purposes, you can make that argument, but generally it doesn't touch on IP yet.
Great. Well, I'll move to the next question just in the interest of time, from Ray Song, who thanks everybody for the seminar. The question of whether panelists think it's necessary to reform the informed consent requirement in genomics research. Deborah, I think you want to reply to this one, but of course everybody can jump in.
Very in brief, yes. And I think we need to, you know, if we think that consent is still something useful for research, which I personally do think it is, then we need to profoundly rethink it and use the new technologies to improve it. And yeah, inform it. It would be a long discussion, but
I gather this relates to the question of sort of, I mean, you can, as we was discussing earlier, you might consent to the primary use of your data, but then you find out that the secondary use is for an entity that you might not agree with, or you may have concerns about, or a purpose that was not what you initially consented to. I don't know, Calvin, if you wanted to jump in on this question of informed consent, coming from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sally. So I haven't spoken much because I'm basically in agreement with what Kira and Deborah have mentioned. So it's worrying, at least from our standpoint, to see data being treated like a resource and essentially that, you see. Of course, there's value in thinking about efficiency, but in this part of the world, we're increasingly concerned with equity. So what ultimately would be fair, and how do we make the entire enterprise remain humanistic, concerned with real human beings, while at the same time supporting scientific development? So, so coming back to this point on consent, I think a lot is very much in the practice. We do have clarity in terms of what broadly would be required, but how do we implement it in a way that continues to be relational? Because in bioethics, there's lots of discussion around what relational autonomy means. And I think that that's perhaps something that we ought to think further about, not so much just simply as a concept, but how do we take it on in terms of whether it's ethics review to the actual engagement with participants. And I think that's what we're trying to do better in this part of the world. Thanks again, Sally.
That's really interesting, Calvin. If I could just ask a follow-up question there. I mean, what does informed consent that takes account of a concept of relational autonomy look like versus kind of standard issue informed consent? Could you just elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, there's quite a bit of discussion in the literature, as you know, but the view that I adopt is that it's essentially a continuum. I'd rather not want to see it like a form of cutoff, like a giveaway. If I consent and therefore
Right.
I'm giving away my data, but rather I remain interested, I remain connected, I want to continue to be involved. I guess I could choose not to be involved, but then if I should ever decide to want to become involved again, I should have the option of doing so. So that's how I understand the relationality in data.
Okay, that's very interesting. And so this helps me understand with your project, this idea of kind of following up later on to see if people are continuing to consent. So there's this kind of ongoing relationship between what in the European health data space we call the data user and I'm not sure, I can't recall the other term actually, Kira, that was in the legislation, but data holder, that's right. So this idea of a continuing and evolving relationship that needs to be audited and monitored rather than the way we typically think about, well, at least as I understand it, informed consent works in medical ethics, which is you sign on the dotted line and then it's once and for all and it's sort of a formality. So that's one way in which to respond to Ray's question. It sounds like that's a potential way of rethinking the notion of informed consent. That's very interesting.
However, the European health data space, if you read the regulation in the preamble, it wants to move away from informed consent. I just wrote it in what rereading it today. It says focus on governance, which is at a lower cost than relying on consent. So it actually is mentioning consent as being too costly for the secondary use of data, which is a bit concerning.
It is fascinating how much, I mean, there's just a clear economic lens to this regulation, and this idea of data is the new oil, and Calvin's point here about the fact that this is not, and it ties in with what Deborah said. It's not a resource. These are people. This is people and people's information.
We saw during COVID that there was actually a pushback to data sharing from some researchers, particularly in the African continent, and they were arguing that data sharing is market driven. It's neoliberalistic, and they very much where their support was waned during the COVID pandemic and the direction in which it's going.
And this is super worrisome, but in general about the approach that ethics is blocking research. And
red tape, for example, the way it's often
exactly. I mean, and even this conversation about consent, I started to work on consent in 2002 for my PhD. And honestly, there are ways for electronic driven ongoing conversation with people, call it dynamic consent, call it Mickey Mouse as you wish, but come on, we have solutions out there. They have been tested. We have been using dynamic consent in our biobank for 10 years. I mean, so if we want to use it, there is a way to do it in a very efficient way. The point is, do we want to let people have control over their data? This is the real question. And this is a political question, it is an economical question, and it is really going into the heart of how we want to imagine our future.
I mean, if I understand you correctly, Deborah, what you're saying is the discourse of economic efficiency is being used as a cover for an attempt to maintain a degree of control, or rather remove control from people, in the sense that
remove rights.
Remove rights, yeah, because ultimately it's not in the interests of a corporation who wants to be able to use health data to make money to allow donors to be forced to have an ongoing conversation with donors. It's, you know, it's a bit of a drag for them, or it will be, you know, an impediment to their profit generating activities. So, but it's not that it's not possible, and it's not that it's not possible in an efficient manner. I'm just going to move on to the last question here from Tim Lee, which thanks everybody for the discussion around genomic data. He wonders how this might change depending on the kind of identifying data. For example, with regards to pandemic surveillance for infectious diseases, there could be an element of geographic identifiability like GPS tracking and location. So Tim wonders if there might be differences in how current regulations in Africa, Asia and Europe treat location-based identifying data versus genomic data. Does anyone want to jump in on that point?
Well, let me have a go at it. It's well, in this part of the world, the response will be yes and no. So, the normative requirements are essentially the same, I would say. But then, of course, where you see differences will be in terms of weighing up the concerns. So, if you're talking about responding to a pandemic. So, of course, there's no fixed way to understand that. There will be social considerations, there'll be political considerations, and then there's question as to, of course, the science around this. But all of this will factor into how ultimately particular actions will be considered to be normatively justified or not. And I use the term norm broadly to mean not just legal requirements, but also ethical ones. So, I guess moving forward, what we will see is hopefully from this particular pandemic, greater clarity. At least that's my hope. In thinking about what's important to communities, what's in, and there I don't mean just local communities, but also the global community, which is why, I mean, if we look at the global community, there is ongoing discussion in the context of the International Pandemic Preparedness Treaty, at least the one that's being proposed. That's one that's going to be one area that's going to be looked into. But otherwise, in terms of the sharing of genomic data, we already see that there are available frameworks, and that has worked relatively well in this pandemic. So if you think about the sharing of the genomic viral data, so that has very much contributed to the rapid development of a vaccine. But going back to the geopositioning kind of data, again, that's going to be a difficult issue because, as I said at the beginning, it really does vary, as we've seen with COVID, very different treatments and understanding. And it's very difficult to say what ultimately is a position that will speak for all different communities, because risk perception, the way that you manage a particular pandemic is just so very different. It basically points us to the need for continuing conversation. So perhaps that's another Fondation Brochet meeting that we could have to talk about. Yeah, so well, that's my 2 cents. Thanks so much for the question. So over to you, Sally.
Thank you. Well, look, this has been fascinating. I'm conscious we're running over time. Just before we sign off, I just wondered if the panelists wanted to make any concluding remarks about the conversation.
I guess I'll just start off with I suppose the main point I'd like to make is that when it comes to data and genomic data, of course, data sharing is crucial, but the main key point is how are we going to do that? And I think it's crucial that there's an ELSI and not just a legal informed approach to the sharing of genomic data.
Thank you, Kira. I think Deborah will be in agreement with you there. Deborah, did you want to?
Very much in agreement. If I can add to that, I think that we need to keep in mind that the goal for which we are using our data, and not only how safely we are sharing our data, is really key to understand why we are doing it and what is the public value that intrinsic to it. Everyone is interested in sharing data for something that is valuable for society and for the world. We need to make sure that this is happening and that safeguards are in place to make this happen in a safe, ethical manner.
Thank you. Calvin, do you have any concluding remarks?
Yeah, just very quickly, as a legal scholar, I'm in agreement with my colleagues, that it really is very important to bring in the ethics, because ultimately law speaks to baseline concerns. So we cannot just simply keep to the baseline, especially if matters of trust, matters of solidarity are important concerns moving forward. So, well, that's my conclusion, and also a note of thanks to all participants, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been really illuminating. It's been a delight to do the research ahead of the conversation and then to hear your perspectives on it. So thank you all so much, and thanks also to those who have attended the meetup today. And take care, and I look forward to following all of your work.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.